So over to you, Lorraine.
Thanks very much. Well, many thanks for coming here, there to the exhibition, which I was really looking, excuse me, forward to seeing it, as it showcases some of the Moravian archive collections and developments that have taken place over the last few years in the Irish Moravian Archives and the congregations there in the Irish districts. From that, I hope you'll be able to learn more about the Moravian Church and their congregation in Northern Ireland. I'm just so sorry I was unable to make it in person today. So I'll be sharing some slides with you on the screen, because this is an ideal opportunity to look at Moravian archives generally, discover what they are, how they evolved, and the importance and the interconnectivity of these collections of archives, which are held at various places around the world. Basically, they are the repositories of the records created by the Moravian Church, and their institutions around the world are collected, preserved, and provide access to make available the inspiring history and documentation of the Church. So for those who are not aware there, the Moravian Church is now a worldwide Christian church, tracing its origins back to the Unity of the Brethren, or Unitas Fraterum, a 15th century movement in Bohemia and Moravia, who suffer from persecution and exile. In 1722, the Protestant refugees from Moravia and others who emigrated from elsewhere in Europe founded the town of Herrnhut on the estate of Count Nicholas Ludwig von Zinzendorf in Germany. Herrnhut then developed into an independent religious community, and this renewed Moravian Church quickly spread through the European continent, Britain, and North America. The first congregations in Britain were settled in London and Fulneck near Leeds in 1742, and then preaching soon began thereafter in Ireland, and Moravian congregations were soon established there. And that you will learn more about in the exhibition there, I'm sure. The worldwide church, referred to as a unity, now consists of 26 provinces around the world. In accord with the general principles of the unity, as contained in statements authorized by the Unity Synod, the provinces governs and administers the affairs of the church within their region. In the British province, officially known as the Moravian Church of Great Britain and Ireland, there are currently 28 Moravian congregations around the UK, and they are directed and controlled by the Provincial Synod. At each level of the church, whether it is for unity, provincial, or congregations, records of their work have been created and kept as instructed by their constitutional documents, such as the Church Order for the Unity or Book of Orders for the provinces. They also stipulate that they must look after these records and archives, and so collections of archives can be found in Moravian congregations around the world. Provincial offices and also the Unity Archives in Herrnhut, Germany, which is the official repository of documents from the main institution of the worldwide church. The provinces were only formally established in 1857, and the archives of the British province, the Moravian Church, are currently located here, where I'm sitting today, in their headquarters in Muswell Hill in North London. To understand how these collections evolved, we must first consider how and why these records were created, as it was not just by chance that these archives developed, but it was from a predetermined collective effort that they still survive. And to do this, we may need to go back to the beginnings and the structure of the renewed church in the 18th century. One of the earliest documents created in the church was the first brotherly union and agreement, containing statutes on how they were to live together, which was signed in May 1727. And this was signed by the first inhabitants of those who had settled on Count Zinzendorf's land in Herrnhut. They considered themselves to be an independent congregation, separate to the parish of Berthelsdorf, to which Herrnhut officially belonged, and subsequently followed a new Moravian discipline and order. They were organized into various groups called choirs, whose membership was based upon age, gender, and marital status. Living together in their respective choir houses, and meetings were held daily with devotions and meditations. However, establishing a new church was not permitted in the Holy Roman Empire at that time, and was also difficult to do so in other more tolerant European states. So by reviving the Unitas Fraterum under Zinzendorf's leadership, it enabled them to introduce many distinctive practices and teachings without raising suspicions, and this was assisted by documenting the events within the congregation. To satisfy the authorities of the bona fides of this new church, Zinzendorf, whose land this new community was built upon, had to justify not only his acceptance of the people who had moved to his estate from other areas of the empire and Northern Europe, but also his religious views. The congregation was interested in their own true and authentic experience of faith, so personal experiences with the divine were then recorded in narratives, such as addresses and discourses, memoirs, also known as Lebenslauf, and diaries, as they needed to document the wonders of God in their midst. Moravians consider these texts as part of the continuous history of the true children of God, beginning with the founding of the church in the 1st century, and the archives were intended as a continuation of the Bible, documenting the history of the children of God. It was intended to be the source from which later generations can learn that the 18th century Moravians were God's people. Therefore, records were stored just for this purpose, and the question of the creation of any central archive, what was to be included in it and what was not given any consideration at first. For a nobleman like Zinzendorf, it was quite common to keep records of their activities wherever they resided. When he was younger, he had been introduced to his future duties as Lord of the Manor by his grandmother, Katharina, and Aunt Henrietta von Gersdorf, and this included looking through the estate's archives, which contained files, correspondence, and literary works, as well as his grandmother's collections of material. He had already established a good record-keeping system for his own records, so that letters received were archived, whilst his secretary and others copied and filed letters that were sent. His role with the development of the church in the first 30 years influenced how it created and kept their records. After the mission work of the church started in 1732, and new congregations and settlements were established around the world, reports of the first Moravian missionaries from overseas began to arrive in Herrnhut. Quasi-official diaries, transcriptions of speeches by Zinzendorf and others, and recording the details of festivals and congregation days began to be retained. These were kept in permanent storage in Herrnhut at first, but still not in any organized archive as we understand today. And they were initially kept only to enable copies to be made, which could be circulated amongst members and friends of the Moravian Church around the world. It was August Gottlieb Spangenberg who was first entrusted with the role of archivist over these Unity records in 1733, and these were what to become later the Unity Archives. It was a recognition of the importance and value of these records to the church. At the end of 1734, he was replaced by Severin Lintrop, who was appointed general correspondent and public clerk. And at the beginning of 1736, he became the Count's archivist and public clerk, with an archive of some of the records then located in Zinzendorf's home in Herrnhut. However, as a result of Zinzendorf's later expulsion from Saxony, the question of the location of these records became an issue. Zinzendorf moved to Berlin in 1737, so he instructed Lintrop to move parts of his archive to a house opposite Monbizio Palace for ease of access. In his Berlin diary of 1737, the archivist Lintrop reported, "On July 26, I got the archives into our garden house and started working on them with great endeavour. I had to look over everything to know what I had to keep and whether I had every piece of paper in its proper place. I therefore labelled the compartments with headings. And then, after finishing his winter séjour, Zinzendorf continued his pilgrimage," he wrote. An attempt by Zinzendorf in 1739 to find a permanent location for the archives in Brandenburg, Prussia, was unsuccessful. Zinzendorf himself was now effectively in charge of the archive, but it was practically untenable, as his other estate work and the question of security prompted further considerations. As one brother commented, "The archive will be safer if it is in the hands of someone other than the Count, because then one would no longer expect to find state matters in it." So the 1740 synod at Marienborn gave responsibility for the archives, publications, along with the establishment and the management of a seminary of the Moravian Church to Polycarp Müller. A few years later, a boys' school was to be established in Marienborn, where plans for an archive, printing house, and bookshop were made. So all the correspondence and publications of the unity could then be produced and kept in one place. Friedrich Emanuel Hermann was formally inaugurated in July 1742 as public clerk, which also included a task of organising and setting up these archives. However, neither Müller nor Hermann seems to have had any significant impact on the creations of the archive itself. This was left to Albert Anton Virchow, who in 1745 began to organise Zinzendorf's letter papers. It was clear, however, that the archive was not very well organised, and it became more of a necessity when, during the synod decided in 1747, the Prussian concessions could not be found. One person complained to Zinzendorf about the state of the archives and that no one knows what is held or where to find documents. And he said, "We would be very unfortunate people if we did not have our scriptures and all the documents in one place. But the uncertainty of your archive, that you do not know what you have or do not have, means that you now come to me to help with your defense, but I cannot prove it." Later in 1751, David Nietschmann wrote in a letter from Virchow, who reported on his archival work. It's mainly involved collecting and storing. The work of organising and cataloguing was left to the people who handed the material over. Virchow's responsibilities increased to include the library of the Theological Seminary, which he had taken over in 1747, and a printing press was established in 1744. So he was the first to bear the title of Archivarius et Bibliothecarius Unitatis Fraterum. But it was not until the early 1740s that the records created in other Moravian congregations around the world became organised. The church asked educated brothers to do the work in the archive, and only those who were able to take minutes, write texts themselves, and if necessary, have them printed. Active documentation and dissemination played the main role in their work, as shown by the combination of archive work with that of editing some documents. A fundamental distinction was made between internal texts and those that were published for the public. A major problem for the archives of this time was maintaining the modest order and integrity of the manageable holdings, as Zinzendorf was constantly removing files and documents because they were needed for travel and in negotiations. and left other records that were not needed at the time, wherever he stayed. So when the Moravian Church's headquarters were moved to London at the beginning of 1749, Zinzendorf observed that there was no central archive of the church and declared in September of that year that there must be a proper archive and registry here in London and their headquarters, which was often referred to as a disciples' house. And so, apart from some archives he had apparently already brought with him, what was considered the important parts of the archive and library were brought to London in 1752 and temporarily stored in a rented house where Zinzendorf resided in the small cloister in the middle of the Westminster Abbey. They had already purchased Lindsay House and adjoining property in Chelsea as a new headquarters for the church. And once some of the work on it had been completed, the Disciples' House then moved from Westminster in March 1753, along with the archives and the Brethren's Library. In the meantime, Abraham von Gersdorf had been instructed to complete the archive and preserve it for posterity, but the overall supervision and practical work was probably carried out by David Nietschmann. The plans in 1752 for the development of Lindsay House and the land in Chelsea included a vaulted archive on the ground floor in a newly constructed outbuilding. 6 months later, Zinzendorf requested that the archive must be brought into complete order as soon as possible, and all documents must be assigned to their class and schema. Everyone from the main congregation workers must know what the main archive as well as the choir houses are. The archive of the synod and the missions are separate, so 4 repositories are required, and another one for my letters and notes. However, Zinzendorf left London in 1755, and the plans for a central unified archive were still not fulfilled. When the Disciples' House moved from Herendink, where it had stayed for almost a year, to Zeist in July 1759, it was again David Nietschmann who accompanied their archive. It remained in Zeist when Zinzendorf moved to Herrnhut for the last time, so that when he died in 1760, not much was left of the promising plans for beginning of the Central Unity Archive. But following his death, there was a demand for a biography of Zinzendorf, and this was actually almost impossible to accomplish due to the lack of access to the extensive records in archive fragments which had been left scattered around. The desire to document the history of the Moravian Church and missionary work had also risen. The next synod to be convened was in 1764 in Marienborn, who decided to establish formally a unity archive for the main purpose of enabling them to write their own history, which they were unable to do until the archives were collected and put into order. So Zinzendorf's comments on archives were then compiled. The future location was decided upon, and 2 commissions were set up. They were to collect, examine, and register the partial archives and collections scattered across Europe to a central archive in Zeist in Netherlands, and then appraise the archival value of each individual item. In 1769, Abraham von Gersdorf presented the synod with a general inventory that had been created. After the archive had already been registered, the commission focused on the main task of appraisal and evaluating the documents. The choice of Zeist as a location for the Unity Archives was made partly due to security concerns following the 7 Years' War. Jakob Jonas Bornstall reports in his travel journal about his visit to the Unity Archives in Zeist at the beginning of 1775. He wrote, "Here you can see 28 cupboards in 2 rooms filled with papers, The cupboards are loose and made in such a way that in the event of fire, they can easily be thrown out of windows into the garden. The archive was located in a one-story extension on the right wing of the castle near the moat. However, the Napoleonic Wars caused some anxiety, and around 1800, conservation issues also arose, with water and mice coming into the archives. The need for action was recognised, and the archive itself was moved to the castle in Barby, and there to Niski and Trebus in 1809. The appointment of Chris Leab Suter as archivist proved to be less than fortunate in retrospect, because he had little expertise and constantly submitted new lists of archives to be destroyed in the first few years of the 19th century. It was partly justified by a lack of storage facilities, but the church leadership, who agreed to many of his recommendations, were afraid that people could be compromised, or that an image could be drawn from the records, from which would differ from the official self-portrayal. The Unity Archive was only staffed part-time for many years, and was later moved to Hernut in 1820, first to the Manor House there. However, there was no room there for the use of the archive, so access was often not available on site. Instead, they would send them archive material out, but as noted with caution, as there was a risk that something might be lost, or that some things might be used indiscreetly or to our detriment. So wherever possible, duplicates or copies were used by the archivist Brothers Feinitz. He and his successors in the 19th century were also editors of various church magazines, which were used to promote the history of the Moravian Church, and printed transcripts of original sources and articles to draw attention to the treasures in the Unity Archives. After 1825, the Unity Archives, with the use of some of the older archives about the church governance and legal documents, were able to make a decisive contribution to the negotiations with church and state authorities, which led to the recognition of the church as a corporation in Saxony in 1844, and allowed the Moravian Church to itself become landowners there. The full extent of the provenance of the archive located at the Manor House became apparent when Alexander Glitch took up his post as Unity Archivist in 1875. The cramped accommodation and conditions of the archive and library on the first floor and in the attic led to the planning of a new archive building. The German Provincial Synod voted unanimously in favour of this proposal in 1878, and then referred the actual decision to the General Synod, as this was the body ultimately responsible for the Unity Archive. A detailed plan of the new purpose-built archive was produced with an estimated cost of 54,000 Reichsmarks, and which was accepted by the 1879 General Synod. Another 9 years passed before the foundation stone for the new building could be laid, and the archives were moved in 1890. It was not until 1907, when all of the older archive collections of the church leadership bodies had been transferred to the Unity Archives, that the archive acquired its central function. So by the time the first Moravian congregation had been established in Great Britain and Ireland in 1742, some experience of record keeping within the church and the style of records had already developed. The first congregation diary was of Hernhut congregation in 1727, although probably compiled several years later from documents in 1732 or 1733. So when other Moravian communities were founded, they were encouraged to keep such a diary, such as the one here from Fetter Lane. From 1741, after the Synod in Marienborn, every Moravian congregation was instructed to keep a communal diary and to record important events of each day. These diaries contain entries about religious meetings, important visitors, the arrival and departure of traveling Moravians, the construction of communal buildings, special religious experiences, and some of the resolutions are the leaders of the congregations. These occurrences were considered to be part of the life of the congregation, part of their service to God, and therefore part of the liturgy. Diaries include some facts about daily life, but more about what was considered as evidence of the way God operated in history. When an event was included in the diary, it was emphasized and obtained an elevated status. By recorded selected events of the day in their communal stories, they made them part of the sacred history of the congregation. When the influence of German leaders lessened and the establishment of a province in Britain in the 19th century, these records no longer served to encourage the congregation and report their successes to the unity leaders. So the meticulous details of the diaries were reduced to more general comments, which are still of historical interest, but continue to include references about local and national events which impacted their lives. And often you will see comments about extreme weather conditions that's happened, as we've had there recently. So minutes were also taken of the congregation's bodies, including the Elders Conference, the Congregation Committee, and the Congregation Council, and other groups within the congregation. And they recorded the decisions made. An example here by the asterisk notes that the single Sister Jane Slade was not admitted to the congregation in Fetter Lane when she applied. So a lot was taken and it was drawn with the answer of no. Discourses were held for the entire congregation or in individual groups or choirs. Many of Zinzendorf's and other leaders' addresses were published, but many more were distributed in the handwritten congregation accounts known as Gemeinachrichten, mainly for the use within the church, and they were often read out. These accounts also reported on the missionary, diaconal, and educational work of the brethren, and were often read out during the meetings. Moravians distinguished between sermons and discourses, addresses and homilies. Sermons in the early days for Zinzendorf were intended to teach the basic principles of the gospel, primarily for a non-Moravian audience, whilst discourses were heart-to-heart conversations with the members. In the 18th and 19th century, very detailed catalogues of the members were regularly created by each congregation. The earliest ones often only list the names, but soon more information was included, such as the composition of each choir within the congregation at a specific point in time. In addition to the name, date, and place of birth, profession, dates of arrival, and admission to the Moravian Church, and any offices or functions in the congregation can be found. Occasionally, other personal information is also included. So each congregation kept their own diaries, minutes, church books, correspondence, sermons and addresses, Lebenslauf and memoirs, and financial accounts. And they were usually stored in the local vestries, manses, or members' basements or attics where space was limited, wherever they could find. In the 18th century, copies were made of these documents and sent to the Disciples' House in Marienborg, London, Zeist, or wherever the church leadership were located at the time. So there were, over the years, there were 70 congregations settled in the British province over the last 3 centuries. And many of them since closed or were amalgamated, and only 28 survive today. due to the closure, lack of storage or support to help maintain and care for them. Some of these congregations have since deposited their archives with other congregations, local records offices, or with the Provincial Archives here in London. A method for the future transfer of their current and more recent records, many of which are now digital, to keep these collections together is yet to be developed. In the meantime, a survey of the records of each existing congregation in this province is currently underway to ascertain exactly what and how their archives and current records are kept and how they are stored. The Book of Order of the British province advises what records congregations need to be kept, and guidelines have recently been distributed on the management and care of their records and archives. The Moravian congregations in the British province who have deposited their collections elsewhere include 5 in the Yorkshire district who have deposited them at the West Yorkshire Archive Service. The archives of Bedford St Luke's Moravian Church went to Bedfordshire Record Office when it closed in 2008. And Bristol Magdalen Street Moravian Church archives went to the special collections of Bristol University before it closed in 1982. The Provincial Archives of the British province was not created until the 19th century. Moravians in Britain formally gained self-governance from the Worldwide Church when they were one of the first free provinces to be established at the 1857 General Synod. British Moravians had urged for the formation of a provincial conference to administer the affairs of the church under the authority of the Unity Elders Conference for some time, and especially at the 1818 Synod. Following a new executive committee, a British Provincial Helpers was constituted. Their first conference was held in Bedford in 1824, but then a synod moved it the same year to the Moravian settlements at Fairfield near Manchester, and later on to Ockbrook near Derby. It was noted in their first minutes that they owed an iron chest was needed to be attained to preserve their deeds, and later recorded that documents and their archive was to remain at Fairfield where they met. The Provincial Helpers Conference was later renamed to the Provincial Elders Conference in 1853, and they eventually moved down to Fetter Lane in London in 1875, where a provincial library was established. The Provincial Archives was held here until August 1839, when they were relocated to the Moravian Church in Tiverton for safekeeping. This was just a month before the war. Whether someone had received a tip-off or the certainty of war breaking out had prompted this move, it was somewhat fortuitous considering that the buildings at Fetter Lane congregation were destroyed by fire from an air raid in 1941. It was recorded at the time that some books of less important matter were left in the strong room of the vestry at Fetter Lane. These have survived the fire and have been since recovered. The Provincial Board continued to meet during the war, often in Tiverton in Wiltshire, and the Provincial Archives were later brought back to London, first stored in one of the board's members' houses, and then moved into the new headquarters of the British province, the Moravian Church in Muswell Hill. This was purchased in 1954 with a new chapel and library built as a new extension was paid for by donations from the American province. Brother Schooling from Hornsey congregation was then appointed in 1959 to look after these archives at Church House in his spare time, and continued to do so for many years. The British Provincial Archives now holds not only the records of the provincial institutes, such as the provincial synods and conferences, the board and provincial committees, but also congregations that have closed, such as Woodford Halls, Haverfordwest, Kingswood, Bath, and active congregations who are unable to store their own archives, such as Fetter Lane, Hornsey, Titherton, Swindon and Lampster. In total, we have about 20 congregation records. We also hold records of Moravian mission work administered by the institutions based in the UK, such as the British Mission Board and the Society for the Furtherance of the Gospel. This is an example of one of the first missions out to Jamaica and the first diary that we hold there, including correspondence from some of the missionaries from Jamaica and Labrador and elsewhere. We also include other items such as a few musical manuscripts, personal papers from workers and members of the church, memoirs from the Moravians, some school records, drawings and prints, silhouettes, topographical materials, photographs and slides, and some artifacts. And here I'm going to just show you a few of the examples that we hold here, which include provincial board minutes and letterbooks, and paintings and images, prints, some of the musical documents, even recordings that were made by missionaries of weather and meteorological observations. And most members of the congregations in the 18th century had to apply to the Moravian Church to join them, and they wrote letters of applications. They were normally scripted by church members and adapted, signed by them, and they went to the lot to be considered. In correspondence from church leaders, from here we have one to James Hutton, one of the early leaders in the 18th century of the Moravian Church in Britain. We also have quite extensive photographic range and lantern slides, which were collected by Moravian missionaries who went round over to India, in the Caribbean, and to Labrador, and correspondence which goes along with it. But the oldest document we have is a deed for land in Bedford dated 1591. The Provincial Archives Library here collects the publications of the Moravian Church and its members, as well as all publications dealing with the Moravian Church. The oldest book in the collection is a history of Bohemia dated 1524. In addition, special collections in several languages, including hymn books, daily texts or watchwords, and a text regarding the ancient unity. The library here is available to researchers to access these documents, and is open most weekdays by appointment. With any collection of archives, it should always be noted that records are created with intent and then preserved, or sometimes destroyed with a purpose and specific reasons. Archivists, therefore, question the traditional idea of archives as an impartial collection of documents, able to give the historian an objective insight into the past. A conscious or unconscious choice to archive something is made. So archivists are not neutral custodians, but are active in shaping the collective memory. Moravian archives were also controlled at times by leaders who wanted to control the narrative of the church by regulating what went into the archive and what was left out. But archiving became a very important Moravian tradition, And we are thankful that they provided all this material, and we continue to carry this tradition on forward today. We are indebted to the work of those volunteers in the congregation who have so tirelessly looked after these records. The detailed records that have survived contain valuable information relating to various subjects, which can be useful to researchers from a range of disciplines, and are still used for the development and the governance of the church today. And those held there in Gracehill are a very important legacy of the Moravian congregations in Ireland. I hope that's given you some insight to Moravian Archives generally, but if you have any questions, please do ask. Thank you very much.
Lorraine, thank you. That was brilliant. I love the idea that Zinzendorf was so keen on archives, wanted them collected, but was himself responsible for scattering them all over the place.
It sort of contradicted what he planned to do, as he liked the idea, but ultimately he wanted to have access and control of archives.
Any questions?
I think when you look at Lorraine's work there and see the books behind her and the cupboards and things, and then you look in next door there, you'll see a big difference.
Oh, there isn't such a big difference, because if Lorraine turned her computer round, can you turn the screen round a bit, Lorraine?
I don't feel bad now.
That's all my work to do. That's keeps coming in with new boxes, running out of space and trying to sort them at the same time.
So Lorraine, you've got a library upstairs. What have you got in the basement? Can you explain what's in the two places?
Yeah, so the library up here contains all the printed publications and journals of the Moravian Church. And also we've got space here, tables here for researchers to come in. So we can have 4 people in at a time here who come to research. And normally have 1 or 2 a week coming in for all sorts of reasons. And then down in the basements is the archives, the manuscript records are kept down there. I think I showed a picture of it earlier, of the rolling stock of cabinets and that we got, which stores the records. In that we keep this library, it's air conditioned, kept at about 19 degrees, just because it's mainly more to keep it at a level temperature rather with no erratic changes. That's the recommended levels to keep, and also to keep the humidity at 55% as well. So archives is downstairs, although that's run out of space, so hence why we got some up in the library, and some's in the chapel downstairs is where I can find space until we get some more storage and can sort through them.
So that recurring historical theme of collecting things and running out of space,
yeah,
it just goes on.
Yes. And I'm sure the scattering the records goes on, because we always get calls from different people saying, oh, we found this document, would you like it? So people found, I'm sure ministers continue to, or in congregations, wherever they moved, people from them moved around, took documents with them and may have forgot to pass them on, or and then I think you always find these people will contact us and then with their discoveries when they're clearing out their houses.
Any questions about the London archives or how archives, how do you know, Lorraine, what is in other collections around the place?
Right, I've contacted most of the archives around Britain, especially those that have gone out of Moravian Church storage. So those like in Bristol University, Bedfordshire, and West Yorkshire Archives services. We've got catalogues or records of them. Some of them have now got online catalogues, so they're available to see and view online of those congregations. We've also had the settlements in England, their catalogues, their archives are being catalogued, and we have copies of those here. So we have Ockbrook, Fairfield and Fullneck here. And we've also had copies of those held in Gracehill. I know we've sent here, Edna Cooper sent us loads of copies of the lists that were produced over the years. And part of this survey we're undergoing at the moment is first just to locate if other congregations are still keeping their archives and other records, and then ultimately we can get lists from them of what they still hold, and then we can collate this and hopefully produce something that will be available to all online.
And I understand it, the minister in each congregation is to keep a diary, is that correct?
Yes.
So could I have an understanding as to what each congregation, including that, what's the sort of thing that would be archived from that?
Do you want to answer that, Lorraine?
But
It's GDPR and things like that now.
yeah, well, as any records that's got personal details in are closed for the lifetime. So we usually close it for 70 years. We've increased that now because as people live longer, so that is usually 80 years. So people are able to access these documents. So that allows people to put information in the diaries, but they're kept obviously by their own congregations, and it depending on the congregation whether they keep their archives local or if they store it elsewhere as to what happens to it. But it's usually nowadays it's normally they comment on the events of the congregation, what's been happening in there, and obviously not so detailed, unfortunately, is what the 18th and 19th century diaries were, where they were more commented. There's more general comments about people in their lives.
Do we have a slight allowance because we're a historic, because of our historic nature?
In what sense?
In GDPR?
Yes, because this is part of GDPR. There is a recognition that archives can be kept with personal details in, so they are exempt from the GDPR rules once they become archive records.
I served a congregation in Leinster once, and the materials were kept in the church vestry, and there had been a big dispute in the congregation at one stage, and obviously during an interregnum somebody had gone in there and they'd removed that diary that had the details. So it's the missing link in Leinster. Yeah. The diary's gone missing because the family didn't want the details of it to be in there. So there's all sorts of things you can tell from what's in the diaries and what's not in them.
Despite diaries out actually that are open today, so you can have a wee look to see what's written in them.
Yeah. That's why it's recommended that all records are kept secure and only access given to people when it's allowed to. So if there is personal details, then those documents need to be kept secure and not given access to until over 80 years have passed to allow. Then you consider opening them up. And even then, sometimes it depends on the family, surviving family that may be around.
1842 Leinster.
Well, oh.
My fault.
I did go and pick up the archives from Leinster. I remember meeting the late Brother McLeavy there, and they
yes,
era and we got him here now.
That's Joseph Shaw in 1842 finishes.
Well, that's fantastic.
1838.
I don't think that's the missing link. It's wonderful to have. Wow, Terry. Right, so that goes with the Leinster collection at Church House.
Oh,
Yes. Yes, you've got to keep it
It's
here.
going through us first of all.
yeah.
Brilliant.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Sorry, one. I love the thought and the principle that was set out of the diaries and the archives being a record of God's people.
Yes.
And I wonder if there are any themes that spring out of maybe the last 50 years of, although you can't look on those 50 years, can you, I guess? But I just wonder if there are themes that spring out of the last, say, let's say 100 years in terms of the Moravian Church, of what God has been doing through his church.
Yes, they use the phrase, document the wonders of God in their midst.
Yeah.
Because I wrote that down too, yes. With an overview, Lorraine, is there a sense of what's been happening over the last 100 years?
Well, I'm just thinking about over there recently when was it Jill Voigt did that talk, is it Corinne Carmelia, about Lebenslauf and how they could be brought back into use today, and how to get congregation members to work and write in their own sort of spiritual accounts of their life and how it can help them today. And that may help to record God's work that's been happening in their lives.
Lebenslaufs were written in the Moravian Church. Each member would be encouraged to write it, a spiritual account of their life. So it would be a biography, but it would be a biography with an emphasis on how they've been led by God throughout their life. And I suppose we're not always very good about talking externally about how God has led us, but it's been amazing, people writing it down, knowing that this will be read at their funeral. So, and we had a wonderful example with your mum, John. She wrote her Lebenslauf and it was read at her funeral. And that was, so I think I would encourage everybody to do that. Not only is it a fantastic social document, particularly of women's work, and a lot of research has been done on women's work because in Moravian records, because of the Lebenslauf, but also because it is so good for congregations to hear how God has moved in that life. And that's a really precious thing. Any other questions? David, sorry.
Lorraine, what's the future for the archive? What's the future plans, or how do we see it?
Right, for the archive in the provincials, the congregations, or?
All of the above.
Oh, the future of the archives, well, it's looking promising, although it may take a little while to get there, because although we've run out of storage here, we are, the board is looking at where we can get extra space and that. And with the creation of the Provincial Archive and Heritage Committee, we can then also work together with the congregations with their archive and heritage to promote and support and share ways that we can work with these. In here at church, the main aim for me is to try and catalogue all the records. It is something I've tried to do since I started here over 20 years ago, but it is still ongoing. All the publications are being catalogued and several congregations, but there's still much to continue with, and that is a long-term work that's underway. I've also got some volunteers trying join in now who help once day a week and that. And we're producing these guidelines and help for a congregation to support them on how they look after their records in archives. But the main concern, I think, for many in the archive world is digital records and how we keep those in the long term. Because what we can access today using programs such as Microsoft Word, will they still be accessible in 30 years time, or will there be another program that's now in main use and no longer be able to access? We've already got documents here from older programs which we can no longer access here. I know the National Archives have been helping by trying to keep these programs available so they can then save them in newer, more modern formats. And they've produced a free program which can help identify all these older types of records not accessible from your computer, which is a start, because we just need to acknowledge which records we can't access, and then once we access it, we need to work out what we need to keep and how we keep them, because I don't think we consider yet that emails is the same of our old letter writing that we used to have in the old days. So this is why we created record retention schedules, which advise everyone what they should keep and then how they can keep it in a way that will be useful for the future.
Oh yeah.
Lorraine, I wanted to say thanks as well, because I thought it was such a wonderful overview of the archive of the Moravian Church, right from the very beginnings to the current day. And I would definitely recommend, if anybody does get a chance to visit any of the other Moravian archives and go and see Lorraine in London as well, to do so, because it's very special experience, and it's fantastic the work that you do there. I was chuckling to see that you still had probably even more boxes there than the time that I visited. I don't know how long ago that was, but given the amount of work that you have to do, I can understand that completely. And just my own personal viewpoint and thoughts on the archives is that I feel much more comfortable with the old archives rather than the new archives and what's being added now in terms of the old archives are so beautiful and handwritten, and now we've all gone digital, so it's but it's still important. It just doesn't have quite the same sort of charm and romanticism about it, and especially now that we don't have the same I was just going to say gossip, but not really that, but it's the same personal details that we have in the old records that perhaps, as you think, I think you said, maybe are left out. Today it's possibly more perfunctory, and you've written down exactly what's happened and what we need to know, but it's not quite the same. But just say thank you.
Good to know what the bishop is sitting down in hers.
Yeah, you're not right now. That's great.
That's okay.
But I would encourage people to write their own personal diaries, because they will be closed and not accessible. So if they're worried about GDPR and other things like that, they could record their own accounts, and members could record their own accounts and then kept safe from that. But I also agree with the digital records of the future don't have the same appeal in that you can't physically touch them, hold them, and that's the whole experience of archives as well. Is the touch, feel, the look, the appearance, rather than some computer format. It's a bit more remote and detached. So yeah, it would be a different experience in the future looking at archives from our time now, which are digital in the future, which they can't, unless of course they print it off in some format, which can help with that, but then it's not how they were originally created, because they were created as a digital record.
Any other questions? Right, don't go, Jackie. Don't go, sorry, don't go, Lorraine. Jackie's there. I'm going to say a few things and then I'm going to ask Christy to come up and speak, because I think any discussion of archives here at Gracehill means that we have to thank a huge number of people. Lorraine has helped immensely in advice and support, but we wouldn't have the archives that we have here without the work of Sister Edna and Brother Joe Cooper, who collected together so much of what we have here.
Just look at my store.
Yes, you know, the records that they collected from Dublin and then the personal archives that they put together. And Sister Roberta Thompson, who has worked for so many years in the Gracehill Archives.
The boss.
Yes, and in starting off the guided tours because of the history she knew from that. And then Brother Anderson Weir, who's been working so hard on the much more recent history, but it will be ancient history in 100 years' time. But it's fascinating now on the burial ground. And of course, Rob Christie, who's worked on the burial ground, and our current archivists, Jackie, Roberta and Sally Ann, helper Amy, archivists from other congregations, and I'm thinking of John Costley here and Violet at University Road and Violet at Ballinderry, and Terry, who has gifted so much to the archives as well, and to people who've helped set up today, David and Sally Ann and Jackie in particular and Roberta, and there's been other people setting up. So just thanks to everybody. We're really grateful for all the work that you've done. And I want now to ask Brother Christie to come up and say a few words.
Nothing about archives, but I'm sure I'm not the only person in the room who surfs the internet from time to time. I usually would do it on eBay, looking for anything of interest. About 6 months ago, I came across something that I thought was very interesting on eBay. And on eBay, you can watch an item. So watch this, because people will come back and maybe make you an offer. Sure enough, the seller of this particular item came back and gave me an offer. I then sent him a message saying why I was interested in this particular item. And we had another conversation and he contacted me via my own email. I presume he found that on the internet somewhere, because you can't put an email address in any eBay message because they went it out. They found it, he emailed me, we had a conversation, we came to an agreement, and I bought the item. Or items. Two books. John Senex's sermons. Original sermons printed in 1787. It's sermons around the United Kingdom. In fact, there's ones that mark all ones there from here. He had delivered at Drumnagargan in County Antrim. There's Ballymena, there's Glunan, and indeed there's something that might please our First Minister, because there's 2 sermons delivered in the north of Ireland. So, hi, welcome. You're going to the church. We're all yours.
I cannot tell you, Christy, how precious this is. Not just for its historical value, but for its spiritual value as well. Because John Sennick was an amazing evangelist. He came to Ireland in 1746, and the Moravian Church in Ireland owes its existence to him. And he gave his life to the Lord aged 18, and he never stopped working for the Lord. Died aged just 36. I think completely worn out, exhaustion from his labours. But he was a man of most generous spirit, of most open heart, and I can't wait to start reading these. So Christy, on behalf of the church, and in particular the archives of the church, thank you so much for this wonderful, precious gift.
Well, they are, some of those copies are the only copies in existence.
Wow. You can't have them, Lorraine.
No, the best left there.